When I opened my husband's Bible and saw the slip of paper fall to the floor, it felt as if the world around me stopped turning. On that small piece of paper, there was only one scrawled line. If she finds out, end her. If she finds out, eliminate her. For a second, my blood turned to ice. Who was she? Was it me? And what was so terrible that knowing it meant I'd have to pay with my life? If you had asked me then, I would have told you I was no longer an ordinary wife. I had become a woman living on the thin line between truth and death. But to understand why that note had the power to change my entire life, I have to take you back to 1983, the year I had just turned 29. I am Eleanor Hayes, living in a small town in Oregon with my husband Richard and our two young children, 8-year-old Daniel and 6-year-old Clara. To our neighbors, we were the perfect family. Richard, with his crisp suits and bank job, was the pride of the community. I was the gentle wife, a homemaker who also did some sewing for regular clients. Every morning I took the children to school, prepared dinner with care, and never missed a church service. Everything looked perfect, at least to the outside world. Inside, though, I always felt a chill. Richard spoke little, was often away from home, especially on the first Thursday of every month. I once tried to ask, "Where are you going, Richard? What kind of work keeps you gone on that day?" He only glanced at me, his eyes cold. "You have a roof over your head, food on the table, and the kids go to school. That's enough. Don't ask more." That answer froze me to the core, but like so many women of that time, I stayed silent. I told myself, duty means acceptance. Until that August morning. A brutal migraine struck me. Daniel and Clara were at their grandmother's, and Richard had left early, saying he had to settle the books at the bank. The house was silent, and I was trembling as I stepped into his study, the one place he had forbidden me and the children to enter. The smell of cigarettes and expensive cologne lingered on the leather chair. Dust lay on the bookshelves, and the desk lamp glowed a weak yellow. I only meant to look for a box of painkillers in the drawer, but a sudden wave of dizziness made me bump hard into the bookshelf. A leather-bound Bible fell to the floor. I picked it up, and in that exact moment, the fateful note slipped out. I remember how my hands shook as I opened it. I remember my heart pounding so loudly my ears rang, and the words appearing before my eyes. If she finds out, end her. It wasn't Richard's handwriting. I recognized immediately that those letters belonged to Martin Crowell, my husband's friend and colleague, the bank manager. He had sent us Christmas cards, and I had seen that handwriting countless times. But why would Martin write such a chilling line to Richard? Who was she? Julia, a name I had never heard. Or me, the wife living under this roof. I wanted to scream. Instead, I folded the note back up, slid it between the Bible's pages, and placed the book neatly back on the shelf as if I had never touched it. I found the box of pills, swallowed one quickly, and sank onto the leather chair. The headache vanished, but in my mind, a violent storm had begun. That evening, when Richard brought the children home, I still cooked dinner, still smiled at Daniel's school stories, still nodded when Richard asked about Clara. But inside, I was no longer the same. I knew that if I confronted him directly, I might be putting myself and my children in danger. That note was no joke. It was a warning. So I chose silence. I would watch. I would listen. I would find out the truth. And most of all, I would never let anyone decide whether I lived or died. Have you ever lived in a house that everyone on the outside praised, yet you yourself felt like a stranger in your own home? I lived that way for years. Richard, my husband, was the man the whole town respected. Every morning he appeared on Main Street in his crisp suit, perfectly knotted tie, and gleaming leather briefcase. He nodded at the neighbors, shook hands with the sheriff, and inquired about the bakery owner's health. Everyone would say, Mr. Hayes is so polite, so kind, the perfect gentleman banker. I usually walked beside him, holding Daniel's and Clara's hands. Admiring eyes turned toward us, and I smiled, though inside I felt only an immense emptiness. Because once our front door closed, Richard was no longer that man. Within those four walls, he spoke so little, it was frightening. He read the paper, drank coffee, and disappeared into his study. I cooked, cleaned, took care of the children, and sometimes heard the slam of the door as he went out at night without a word of explanation. The worst were the first Thursdays of every month. On those mornings, he always rose earlier than usual, put on his finest suit, and sprayed the special cologne reserved for special business. Then he vanished for the entire day, sometimes the whole night. Once I gathered all my courage to ask directly, "Richard, these Thursday trips, where do you go?" He looked up from his paper, his eyes like ice. His voice clipped. "You have a home to live in, food to eat, and the children go to school. That's enough. Don't ask more." I went numb. In that moment, I no longer felt like a wife, but like a possession being kept. After that, I began paying closer attention. The drawers of his desk suddenly had locks, and the key was always in his pocket. Whenever I entered the room, he snapped files shut and stuffed them into his briefcase. Some nights, I caught him whispering on the phone, lowering his voice as if afraid I'd overhear. If I happened to pass by unexpectedly, he'd turn his back and pretend to cough. And those eyes, the eyes I once believed were honest, they no longer looked straight at me. Instead, they darted away, as if he feared that if I stared too deeply, something dreadful would be revealed. Since finding the note in the Bible, every small detail struck me more sharply than ever. Before, I could brush it aside. He's just busy. But now, I could no longer fool myself. I reviewed every piece of our marriage. The polite smiles in front of neighbors, the small gifts he brought home on holidays, as if to maintain appearances. The dinners I carefully prepared, he ate absent-mindedly without a word of praise. The perfunctory hugs done only out of habit. All of it. Just a perfect performance. A stage on which Richard played the devoted husband, and I was cast as the lucky wife, hiding a truth I still hadn't uncovered. I began observing more closely. One morning, while tidying his coat, I heard a rustling of papers in the pocket. My heart raced, but he appeared suddenly and snatched the coat away, forcing a stiff smile. "I'll put it away myself." Another night, when I woke at midnight, light spilled from under the study door. I crept closer. Through the narrow crack, I saw him signing a stack of papers, then quickly stashing them in a small metal box. I stood there, heart about to burst, but I didn't dare push the door open. The more I thought about the note, the more it chilled me. Why would Martin Richards' best friend, the bank manager, write such a threat? If she finds out, end her, I told myself dozens of times. Maybe I misunderstood, maybe it had nothing to do with me, but every time I caught Richard's evasive eyes, heard his whispers on the phone, saw those mysterious Thursday trips, I knew the warning was meant for me. And the fear grew. If I kept pretending ignorance, would I one day simply vanish, with everyone hearing only a neat explanation? She was sick. She was tired. She left. So I began keeping a journal, not to complain, but to record every detail. The hours he left and returned, the unusually long phone calls, even his expression when I said I would take the children to visit my mother. How relieved he looked, as if he needed me gone to do something. I knew I was entering a dangerous game, but without it, I would remain a puppet on his stage forever. Some nights I lay listening to the rain against the window, staring at the man sleeping beside me, his breathing steady. I wondered, was I lying next to my husband or to a stranger? A stranger who might be plotting to kill his own wife. That thought made me shudder, but it also pushed me to grow stronger. I could no longer be just the lucky wife in the neighbor's eyes. I needed to know the truth. I needed to tear off the mask of that so-called perfect facade. From that moment on, I knew my life would never go back to what it was. I, Eleanor Hayes, had stepped 1 foot off the false stage into the shadows of secrets. And I vowed to myself I would be the one to rewrite the script. Do you know what it feels like to touch clear proof that your husband has betrayed you when it's no longer just a suspicion? For me, it was like being slapped across the face with an icy hand, not once, but hundreds of times. One morning, I was ironing Richard's favorite ash gray suit, getting it ready for his trip to Portland. My habit was to carefully check all the pockets for tissues or receipts. But that day, my fingers touched something thicker than usual. I pulled it out. It was a receipt from a luxury jewelry store in Portland, with the words boldly printed, "Engagement ring, diamond solitaire." The price was staggering, nearly 3 times what he had given me for our entire household each month, and I felt dizzy. My heart clenched. In 10 years of marriage, I had never received a gift that expensive. My wedding band was a simple gold ring, with no diamond or flourish. He had never bought me any other ring. So, who was this ring for? I also found a small folded slip of paper with an address in Portland hastily written on it. I had never heard of that street. I refolded the receipt and the slip of paper, put them back in the pocket, and laid the suit back on the ironing board. My hands shook so badly that the iron nearly scorched the fabric. All day I couldn't focus on anything. Questions tore through my mind. Who was supposed to receive that ring? Why did Richard hide an address in his pocket? And most of all, what were all those monthly trips to Portland really for? I knew I had to see it with my own eyes. A few days later, I used an excuse that I needed to buy special fabric for a client's dress order. I told Richard, "This kind of fabric is only available in Portland. I want to pick it up in time for the order." He simply nodded, seemingly without suspicion. Perhaps he thought I was too obedient to do anything beyond sewing and taking care of the children. The road to Portland was over an hour's drive, but my heart was pounding as if heading into battle. I followed the address on the slip of paper. It led me to an upscale neighborhood of well-kept homes with carefully tended gardens. I stopped in front of a 2-story house with vibrant hanging flower baskets on the balcony. My heart skipped a beat. I asked a woman watering her plants nearby, "Excuse me, do you know who lives in that house?" She smiled kindly. "Oh, that's Julia Bennett's house. She's an elementary school teacher. Such a sweet girl. She's expecting a baby soon. I heard her fiancé works in another city and can only come on the first Thursday of the month. They're planning to marry after he divorces his wife. Poor thing, having to wait like that." Each word stabbed into my heart like a knife. First Thursday of the month, fiancé, waiting for a divorce. I didn't need anyone to name names. I knew it was Richard, and the ex-wife they mentioned was me. I felt my knees go weak. I quickly thanked the neighbor and turned away before the tears could spill. I couldn't let a stranger see me break down right there. On the way back, the scenery outside the window blurred like shattered fragments. I felt as if I were living in a nightmare where the truth revealed itself with ruthless clarity. Richard hadn't just betrayed me. He had built an entirely new life, complete with a beautiful home, a young lover, and a child on the way. When I stepped into our kitchen, the familiar table where Daniel and Clara chattered about school every day, I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. In our children's eyes, the family was still intact, their father still the model man. They had no idea their world was about to explode. That evening, when Richard came home, I watched him closely. He still took off his suit jacket, hung it neatly, washed his hands, and sat down at the table. He told a few trivial stories, flashing his polite smile. If I hadn't seen the house in Portland with my own eyes, hadn't heard the neighbor's words, maybe I would have gone on deceiving myself. But now, every smirk, every evasive glance of his had become evidence of betrayal. I stayed silent. I didn't confront him. I knew that if I revealed what I had discovered, the note in the Bible might become reality. That night, lying next to him, listening to his steady breathing, I asked myself, did this man ever truly love me? Or was I, from start to finish, only part of the facade he built, while his real love belonged elsewhere? I turned toward Daniel and Clara, sleeping peacefully in the next room. In the darkness, I whispered to myself, for the children, I must stay clear-headed. I must uncover the whole truth before it's too late. From that moment on, I was no longer the obedient wife who only waited. I had become the observer, the silent investigator in my own home. Do you believe that a single small key can open the door to a nightmare? I do, because I once held in my trembling hand the key that led me to the most horrifying truth of my life. I remembered a few months earlier, while tidying Richard's shaving supplies, I had come across a strange key. It didn't look like a room key, nor a car key. When I asked, he only gave a dry laugh. The key to an old file cabinet at the bank. Nothing important. Then he snatched it from my hand and put it away. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But after discovering the house in Portland, the receipt for the ring, and the note in the Bible, the memory of that key haunted me. I was certain it was hiding something he never wanted me to see. One morning, after Richard left the house early, I tore through his study. All the drawers and file cabinets were locked. I knelt down and felt inside the closet. Behind a stack of old suitcases, I found a wooden box that was unusually heavy. I dragged it out. Under the thin wooden layer was a gray metal box, the very one. My hands shook as I searched around. In the bookshelf, I found an unusually thick book with its insides hollowed out. Inside lay the key. My heart pounded as I slid it into the lock. Click the lock, and it pops open. Inside the box, the entire truth lay bare, merciless and raw. First, there were 2 plane tickets to Brazil under the names Richard Hayes and Julia Bennett. The flight was booked for the following week, exactly matching the extended business trip Richard had mentioned. Next were forged documents, new passports, all under different names but with Richard's and Julia's photos. Then a bundle of love letters was tied with a blue ribbon. I opened them. My love, I've already set up the baby's crib in the bedroom. I dream of the day you'll rock our son to sleep. Martin says if she finds out, you know what to do. But I believe we'll get through this. I need you, Richard, me, the baby, and just a few more weeks, and you'll be mine completely. No more ties, no more past. Each line was a blade slicing deeper into my heart. The she in those letters was me, and Martin, none other than Martin Crowell, Richard's best friend, the bank manager, was the author of the threatening note I had found in the Bible. Then it struck me. This wasn't just infidelity. Richard and Martin were plotting to embezzle a massive sum from the bank. Brazil wasn't just the place for a honeymoon with his lover. It was the destination where they'd disappear with the stolen money. And me? I was the obstacle. If I found out the plan, I would be eliminated. I sank onto the floor, the letter slipping from my hand. Tears welled but dried quickly as my body shook with tension. Daniel and Clara's faces appeared vividly in my mind. If I stayed silent, waiting for Richard to vanish, we'd be left penniless. If I spoke out, I might not live long enough to protect them. A chill raced down my spine. I pressed my hand to my chest, forcing myself to breathe. In that moment, a single thought rang out clearly. I will not be the victim. I will protect my children. I carefully replaced everything, put the letters back, locked the metal box, and set it in its place. I knew from then on I could trust no one. Not friends, not neighbors, not even Richard's family. They all believed he was the perfect husband. It was just me, the horrible truth in my hands, and two small children who needed me to shield them. I stood up, wiping my tears. In the mirror, I saw a different face, no longer just a gentle housewife. It was the face of a woman ready to fight. That night, I lay beside Richard. He turned his back, breathing steadily, probably dreaming of a faraway life with Julia and the baby in her womb. I stared into the darkness, silently promising myself, "You can deceive, you can betray, but you will never destroy me and the children. I will stop this plan, no matter what it takes." Inside me, fear turned into fire, a fire of resolve. I was no longer the deceived wife. I was Eleanor Hayes, and I would write my own fate. People often say, when a woman discovers the truth, she will either forgive or leave. But for me, when I learned that my husband was willing to destroy our family to chase another life, I chose a third path: strike before becoming the victim. After discovering the metal box containing evidence of betrayal, I knew I couldn't just sit still. If I only cried and despaired, Richard and Martin would still carry out their plan, abandoning me and the children, or worse, erasing us to cover their tracks. The first thing I needed was a financial footing. Richard had always controlled all the household finances. I was only given a fixed monthly allowance to cover the entire family's expenses. However, I was fortunate to have saved my sewing over the years, secretly setting aside every small payment from clients. I carefully confided in Mrs. Eulalia, a wealthy widow and loyal client who lived on a farm outside town. She had often told me, "Eleanor, a wise woman must always keep a little money of her own. Never depend entirely on a man." That day, while altering her granddaughter's wedding gown, I gathered my courage. "Mrs. Eulalia, could you help me open a small account at another bank? In Salem, perhaps? Just money from my sewing work." She stared at me, her eyes filled with experience. I knew she understood more than what I was saying, but she only smiled, took my hand, and said, "Of course. I'll take you tomorrow. We women must always think ahead." For the first time in my life, I had a secret account in my own name. I put all my savings into it. Not much, but to me, it was a lifeline. Next step, gather evidence. On a trip to Portland, I bought a small Kodak camera, tiny enough to hide in a fabric pouch. Whenever Richard left the house, I would slip into his study, open the metal box, and photograph every document. The plane tickets, forged papers, love letters, and jewelry receipts. My hands shook so badly that many pictures came out blurred, but I pressed on. Each click echoed in the silence, making my heart race as if it might burst. If Richard returned suddenly, I'd never escape in time, but I knew without evidence my words would only sound like the desperate cries of a betrayed wife. I needed irrefutable proof so that if cornered, I could protect myself and the children. Still, photographs alone weren't enough. I needed copies of the documents themselves. That would be undeniable evidence. Our town had only one general store with a photocopier. The owner, Mr. Motzer, was a stern man who rarely let anyone use it. I went in, weaving a story. I want to make a keepsake album for Richard as an anniversary surprise. I have the children's birth certificates, our marriage license. I'd like copies, just in case they're lost. He eyed me suspiciously, but I sweetened it. "If you agree, I'll sew your wife a new cloak, no charge." At last, he consented. Trembling, I laid Richard's hidden documents onto the glass. The machine hummed ERRR like a battle drum. I kept glancing at the door, terrified someone might walk in. When I finally held the stack of copies, it felt like holding my very life in my hands. With evidence in hand, the question remained, what to do with it? I couldn't go to the local police. Richard and Martin's connections ran deep, from the sheriff to the priest. I remembered Inspector Robert Hale, the banking investigator from Salem. He was known for integrity and visited our town every few months to audit the books. Richard often complained, "That Hale is always poking around, such a nuisance." Precisely for that reason, I trusted him to be my only hope. I prepared a thick envelope containing the photocopies, photographs, and a handwritten letter. "Dear Inspector Hale, I am Eleanor Hayes, the wife of Richard Hayes, an employee of the local bank. I hold evidence that my husband and Martin Crowell are planning to embezzle a large sum of money and flee. Please keep my identity confidential, for if they find out, my life and my children's lives will be in danger. But how could I deliver it safely without suspicion? I found a way. My daughter, Clara, often played with Marietta, the innkeeper's daughter in town. I arranged for Clara to visit, and while dropping her off, I whispered to the innkeeper, 'Could you help me with something small? I'd like to surprise Inspector Hale with a packet of family documents when he stays here. Please keep it discreet.' The innkeeper, fond of me for the sewing I often did for her daughter, nodded. I slipped the envelope into the handbag she lent me. That way, when Hale arrived, she would hand it to him without anyone suspecting. When I left the inn, I exhaled deeply. I had just wagered my entire life on that envelope. Besides striking back, I also had to prepare an escape. I phoned Maggie Collins, my childhood friend, now living in Portland. I didn't tell her everything, only said, "Maggie, if one day I have to leave town with the children, could we stay with you?" Maggie didn't ask questions. She answered firmly, "You and the kids will always have a place in my home." Hearing that, I broke down in tears. For the first time in weeks, I felt I wasn't completely alone. That night, I sat by the window under the bright moon. Richard slept soundly in the bedroom, perhaps dreaming of Julia and the unborn child. I held the stack of documents tight and whispered to myself, "I won't let him destroy this family. I will fight. And if I fall, at least I will have done everything to protect my children." From that moment, I knew I had stepped into a new role, no longer the betrayed wife, but a silent warrior preparing for an uneven battle. Have you ever watched someone about to leave forever, yet they act as though they're still sitting in the familiar kitchen of their family home? I witnessed that in Richard, my husband, on the night before his entire world came crashing down. That dinner was strange, not like the dull, lifeless meals we usually had. Richard ate more slowly, gazing at Daniel and Clara for a long time as if trying to etch their faces into memory. I sat across from him, silently studying every expression, my heartbeat racing. After the table was cleared, he suddenly pulled out his wallet and slipped a wad of cash into my hand, more than double what he normally gave me for a whole month's expenses. "Buy yourself something. And for the kids, too," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, almost forced. I swallowed hard. I knew this wasn't generosity. This was a farewell gift. He believed that by the next night he'd vanish from my life, taking with him the embezzled money, Julia, and her unborn child. I forced a smile, tucked the money into the kitchen cupboard, and turned back to Daniel and Clara, who were chattering about school. Inside, I prayed. Lord, let tomorrow come quickly, and let Inspector Hale act in time. That night I tossed and turned. Richard slept soundly, breathing evenly like a man certain of victory. I lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, counting every tick of the clock. I knew I was wagering everything. If Inspector Hale didn't move, if the envelope hadn't reached him, tomorrow would be the day I lost it all, even my life. The next morning was brilliantly clear, sunlight pouring through the windows. Richard rose early, immaculate in his dark blue suit, his tie knotted more carefully than usual. He barely touched breakfast, then bent down to kiss Daniel and Clara on the cheek, a rare gesture. "I'll be home late tonight." "Don't wait up," he said, avoiding my eyes. I nodded, hiding the trembling inside me. By noon, the news struck like thunder. Word spread that police from Salem had stormed into the bank, led by none other than Inspector Robert Hale. Richard and Martin had been caught red-handed, attempting to transfer a massive sum into a fake account. I heard it from my neighbor, who rushed over, her face flushed with excitement. "Eleanor!" They arrested Richard, and Martin too, right there at the teller's desk. My God, did you know anything about this? I clung to the doorframe to steady myself, forcing calm into my voice. Inside, a wave broke free. The envelope had made it. Inspector Hale had believed me. Richard's plan was over. By afternoon, the entire town was buzzing. Crowds gathered in front of the bank, gossip flying. Curious, pitying, and scornful eyes followed me as I walked by to pick up my children from school. Poor thing, married to a thief. Do you think she knew? Or maybe she was in on it. I heard every whisper, every half laugh, but I clenched my jaw and lifted my head high. If I faltered now, I'd be exactly what they thought, a pitiful, betrayed woman left behind. When Daniel and Clara came running out, proudly showing their drawings, they had no idea that their world had just been turned upside down. I squeezed their hands and forced a smile. Let's go home. Inside, I breathed out in relief. At least they were safe. At least Richard no longer had the chance to harm them. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. No heavy footsteps, no slamming study door. I looked around the dinner table, just the three of us. Yet the empty chair beside me made my eyes sting. I was no longer the wife of Richard Hayes. From the moment he was led away in handcuffs, I had become the wife of a bank embezzler. A painful label, but at least it came with the truth that I was alive and my children still had their mother. That night, I lit a small candle and prayed in silence. My mind replayed the long, harrowing path, the note in the Bible, the metal box, the love letters, the secret envelope, all the fragments that had led to this moment. Richard had fallen, and I thought burdened by the town's scrutiny was still standing. And I swore to myself this was only the beginning. They say when one door closes, God opens another. But what no one tells you is that to walk through that new door, you must first step across the shards of the past. I learned that when I was forced to leave the very house I once called my home. After Richard's arrest, the bank seized our assets to recover the losses. Our small house had long been mortgaged, and now it was considered evidence. A dry, businesslike clerk knocked on my door and handed me a notice. The children and I had 30 days to vacate. I looked around the familiar walls of the living room, where Daniel had once built his wooden towers, the kitchen where Clara had baked her very first cake. All of it was now nothing more than memories sealed away. I didn't cry. My tears had long since dried up. I simply folded clothes into an old suitcase, pulled my children close, and whispered, "We'll start over. Somewhere else." I called Maggie Collins, my childhood friend in Portland. Maggie didn't ask for details. She simply said, "Eleanor, come. The back room at my workshop is free. You and the children can stay there." So I packed what little we had left and took Daniel and Clara on the bus to Portland. Our rented room was barely big enough for a double bed and a small table. The bathroom was shared with the workshop, but at least it had a roof, the warmth of friendship, and most importantly, it was a new beginning. The first day I stepped into Maggie's workshop, I inhaled the scent of fabric, thread, and the dampness of old wood. I knew this would be the place where I rebuilt my life. I started small, hemming dresses, taking in jackets and hand-embroidering tablecloths. Initially, it was just a few clients, but soon word spread. Mrs. Hayes is very skilled. Her stitches are neat and fine. I worked day and night, my hands calloused, my eyes strained under the yellow glow of the lamp. Yet inside me, a new light flickered. Pride. This was the first money I had ever truly earned on my own, not dependent on anyone else. Months passed, and just as life began to find its rhythm, another twist arrived. One afternoon, a gentle knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find Julia Bennett Richards' lover standing there with a newborn in her arms. The baby's face was scrunched, but its eyes were clear and bright. I froze. Rage surged up in me, screaming to shout, "You are the reason my family was destroyed." But Julia didn't look like someone who had won. She was gaunt, her clothes wrinkled, her hair in disarray. Tears streamed down her face as she handed me a letter. It was Richard's handwriting. "Julia, I can't support two families. You're on your own." Just a few short, cold lines like a death sentence. Julia collapsed into a chair, clutching the baby tightly. Her voice broke. "Do you know? I waited for him all those months. I believed that even in prison, even with nothing left, his love for me was real. That's when he got out. He'd come back for me and our child. I believed so foolishly." I looked down at the baby in her arms, Ethan, innocent and fragile. In those clear eyes, I saw Daniel and Clara as infants. Julia went on, choking back sobs. "My parents disowned me. They called me a disgrace. I have nowhere else to go. Please, give me work. I can wash, clean, anything. Just a place to stay, a little money to feed my child." I went silent. Inside me, a battle raged. Part of me wanted to throw her out, let her taste the loneliness I had endured. But then I looked at the baby, a life abandoned not by choice, but by the selfishness of the man we had both once loved. I heard my own voice whisper, "My children and this child, they share the same blood. I can't turn away." Julia moved into the small room next door. I arranged for her to help in the workshop, welcoming clients, keeping records, and handling numbers while I focused on the sewing. It wasn't easy at first. Each time I saw her cradle her baby, I remembered Richard dreaming of a life with her while I was cast aside. But soon I realized Julia, too, was a victim seduced by sweet promises, discarded with a ruthless letter. Gradually, we learned to work side by side with each other. Julia was meticulous, her records precise, and she had a gentle way of speaking that made clients feel valued. I poured myself into the needle and thread, crafting dresses that fit beautifully. One evening, after Daniel and Clara were asleep and Julia was rocking Ethan, she looked at me and whispered, "I know I'm the reason your life fell apart. I don't expect forgiveness, but thank you for not abandoning me and my son." I didn't answer right away. I only looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. Then I said softly, "We were both deceived by the same man. The best thing we can do now is stand together, not against each other." From that moment, we were no longer rivals. We became allies. In the small back room of the workshop, two women who once despised each other now sat side by side discussing orders, sharing tips on raising children, even laughing over a clumsy stitch. I knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult, but at least, from the ruins, we had begun to build something new. A different home, a different family, a different life. People often ask me, "What saved you from falling into the abyss of despair after everything that happened?" I usually smile and don't answer right away, but deep down, I know. It wasn't any miracle. It was my own trembling hands back then choosing not to give up. I chose to be reborn instead of burying myself in the ashes. The early years in Portland were unbearably hard, but little by little, Julia and I transformed that tiny back room of the workshop into a small boutique called Atelier Hayes and Bennett. At first, the name made people whisper, "The wife and the mistress of the same man daring to open a business together?" But we ignored them. The only thing that mattered was that every dress we made was elegant, well-fitted, and meticulously crafted. Customers noticed. Housewives, young girls, and wealthy ladies all began to come. Soon, no one cared about the story behind it. They only cared that our work was beautiful and worth their money. I still remember the first major compliment. A female journalist wrote in the local paper, Atelier Hayes and Bennett brings a touch of Parisian elegance right to the heart of Portland. I sat in silence for hours, my eyes wet. For the first time in years, the name Hayes was no longer associated with crime and disgrace, but with creativity and pride. My children grew up alongside the shop. Daniel, my eldest, was always fascinated by numbers. He would sit for hours working through math problems and sketching bridges with his pencil. His dream was clear. "Mom, I want to be an engineer to build bridges so no one has to be afraid of being left behind." I smiled, thinking he had already built the first bridge, one that connected me back to hope. Clara, my daughter, inherited the love of art. She often sat in the corner of the shop sketching dresses from her imagination. Many times I took her drawings and turned them into real garments. Customers adored them. I realized Clara wasn't just sketching dresses, she was sketching her future. And Ethan, the baby I once hesitated to accept, grew up in the warmth of both Julia's and my love. I treated him like my own blood, because half of him was tied to my children's bloodline. Ethan called me Aunt Eleanor, but sometimes the way he looked at me was no different from a child gazing at his mother. Years passed, and the two women who had once stood on opposite sides now lived like sisters. We shared joy, faced hardships, and took pride in watching our children grow up healthy and kind. We had been reborn from the ruins. Then one day, the past knocked on the door again. It was an autumn afternoon. The boutique was busy when I heard an employee call out, "Mrs. Hayes, there's a man asking to see you privately." I stepped out and my heart skipped. It was Richard. He had changed so much that I had to look closely to recognize him. His once black hair was now almost entirely gray. His face was lined, his eyes weary, his posture bent as if crushed under an invisible weight. The suit he wore was clearly old and ill-fitting. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling. I kept my composure and nodded. "Come in, we'll talk in the office." In the small back room where Julia and I usually planned orders, Richard sat across from me. He glanced around, his eyes filled with bitterness at the shelves of fabric, the sketches, the dresses, everything I had built without him. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice shaking. I looked straight into his eyes without hesitation. "I am happy in spite of you, not because of you." Silence filled the room. Richard lowered his head, his shoulders trembling. Perhaps he had expected blame or tears. But I had no tears left for him. I had wept them all away the day I found the note in the Bible. We sat in silence for a long while. Then he rose unsteadily and walked out. No promises, no apologies, and I no longer needed them. Today, as I sit here at 74 years old, my hair white as snow, the laughter of my grandchildren echoing around me, I tell them this story. Their eyes widen, unable to believe their grandmother once faced such danger. I smile at their young faces and say, "The day I opened your grandfather's Bible and saw that note fall out, I thought it was the end. If she finds out, end her. A threat, a shadow hanging over me. But in truth, it was the beginning of a new life, a life I claimed for myself. I was no longer a submissive wife. I became a woman who knew how to rise, protect her children, and rebuild everything from ruins. Remember this. Sometimes a door closes only so you can walk through another, brighter, wider one. And it's you who must decide whether to take that step." I pause, breathing deeply. A strange gratitude wells up in me, even for the pain, the betrayal, the nights of despair. Because without them, I would never have become the woman I am today. A woman reborn from ashes, who found happiness on her own terms.